everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to be here. My name is Arnoldus Nyamande. I'm a policy manager at BCS and your host for today's Policy Jam, where we are talking about our latest paper titled Helping AI Grow Up Without Pressing Pause. And you can join the conversation online on all social media platforms using the hashtag BCS Policy Jam. The Policy Jams are something we've been doing for over a year now. Essentially, they're a platform for you to come and engage with a panel of experts on the hot topic of the day. And today we're talking about AI, which has been in the news a lot lately. So the Future of Life Institute released a paper titled, an open letter, titled us oh my God, I'm so sorry. Start again. The Future of Life Institute released an open letter signed by over 1,000 industry leaders and big names in AI, calling for them to press pause on AI. They argued that AI systems with human competitive intelligence can pose profound risks to society and humanity, and therefore we need to put the brakes on that while we figure that out in essence. BCS, in response, released a paper in May 2023 saying that we need to help, we can and we need to help AI grow up without pressing pause. And I've got a brief overview of the paper, the key messages here, but I'm not going to spend too much time doing that simply because one of the co-authors, Adam Leon Smith, is on the call and he's much better qualified to talk about it. But essentially the message was, it won't work, pressing pause is not realistic, especially given the instrumental role of AI in finding solutions to the key problems of today. And it also had some recommendations, again, which I won't be spending too much time getting into. I've got an excellent panel of speakers today and I want to make it as much use of their time as possible and for you to engage with them. So I won't spend too much time on this. And I'm going to introduce you to the panel now. First, we have Adam Leon Smith, FBCS. He is the Chief Technology Officer for Dragonfly, and he is also the chair of the Fellows Technical Advisory Group, aka FTAG. And we're also joined by Steve Randall, who is a technical expert at UCAS with a K, which is the world's leading accreditation body. Rashik, our CEO, is running a bit late, so we're going to skip over him and go to Carrie Miller. She is the Principal Practice Lead for Responsible AI and Governance Research at the Center for Inclusive Change in the US. And also we have Hadrian Pouget, who is the Visiting Research Analyst on AI Policy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you all for joining us today, with special thanks for Hadrian and Carrie, who are in the US and woke up stupidly early to be here today. We're really, really grateful for you taking the time to be here today. I do want to open up the floor to, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. I want to get started as quickly as possible so we can get the conversation going with our panelists. So my first question is an open one to everyone on the panel, which is, how would you respond to calls to pause AI developments, considering its central role, its impact on vital innovation in areas such as health and climate change?
So shall I start with that one and sort of summarize what the BCS position is at the moment? So we didn't agree with the call for a pause for a number of reasons. I think the main one is we don't believe anybody would stop, certainly not people who wanted to get ahead for economic reasons or reasons of national defense. So it would be a asymmetric pause. We were also pretty skeptical about some of the reasons that a pause was being called for, such as, there being a glimpse of general AI just around the corner. I think we're a little bit skeptical that we're going to see significant progress in the LLM space, and I think that's something even Sam Altman has acknowledged, that we're coming to the end of what we can do by just scaling those models. We also took a view that we support the government's recent white paper on how to regulate AI. Now, some say the UK government isn't going far enough and fast enough, in that it's not pursuing a similar approach to, for example, Europe. But if we actually look over at what's happening in Europe, there's an intent to pass a piece of primary legislation which defines high-risk types of AI and mandates what's called ex ante, so before something's available, conformity assessment, so independent audit of something before it's placed on the market. The reality is it's taking years to implement the systems and processes around that. And what the UK is saying is we're going to use the laws we have now, and we're going to use the regulators we have now, but we're going to augment that with a central horizon scanning regulator looking for gaps in what the other regulators are doing. And we're going to accelerate an AI sandbox. Now, a sandbox is something that's been used in the UK very successfully in fintech and increased the speed of innovation whilst maximizing regulatory learning. And we think that regulatory learning can be not just replicated, but expanded upon. So, for example, BCS obviously cares a lot about professional registration and professional skills. We think defining skills and professional standards it could be an output of the sandbox through a collaborative activity that isn't just regulators and innovators, but also includes other participants, maybe even non-profits. So we think actually do more faster with that sandbox. Get in there now ahead of Europe, deciding what all its rules are and setting up its sandboxes. Let's get started, bringing different people like BCS into the room and using those beyond purely a regulatory need. And I think if you look over at Europe, there's an increasing acknowledgement in the text of something called real world testing. And this thing that exists before you actually place something on the market, but is a controlled environment for experimenting with AI and learning different things about it. And I think the line between ex ante conformity assessment, checking something carefully before releasing it, and a more controlled usage with health warnings, monitoring, and regulators all over things, I think that pragmatic, that border will kind of fade, and I think we'll be more pragmatic about how we regulate AI than Europe's proposing going forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome, Rashik. We're just asking the question, how does the panel respond to the government's call to pause AI, considering its potential to provide answers to today's problems? I don't know if anybody else on the panel wants to step in.
I can maybe just jump in slightly in defense of the letter, if not in defense of the pause itself. I think the people writing the letter, I imagine we're aware that a 6-month pause itself was impracticable. And I imagine it's also a product of trying to build such a large coalition. There's a lot of people in this group. I think the one thing they all agree on is that AI is going too fast and needs some more time to figure out what we're doing. The 6-month pause is like a flashy, sort of eye-catching way to put that. And to that extent, I think they succeeded. I mean, it was even talked about yesterday in a congressional hearing within the US. So yeah, I would say that maybe getting the sort of underlying message is, I think, what a lot of people signed up on, the more like AI is going too fast, we need to do something about it, rather than specifically the recommendation for a 6-month pause. I mean, if they'd written like a 40-page paper explaining exactly what their policy proposal was, no one would have read it and no one would have signed it. So
I think there is a level of sensationalism in the messaging, but I think the sentiment, which is, do we fully understand the ramifications? Do we understand the kind of unintended consequences of the AI that we're pushing out there? Is a very valid set of concerns, right? And I think what we were trying to do with the BCS paper, which is really important, is provide some practical ways of doing something to understand those unintended consequences, understand the implications of what's happening here. And I think that's a much more important and more valuable way of doing that. Again, it's not sensationalist, but actually is practical and helpful.
Thank you, Rashik. And for those of you who don't know, Hadrian just mentioned yesterday that the CEO of OpenAI, which is the company behind ChatGPT, yesterday sat and gave evidence to the Senate in the US. And while he was doing that, he and other witnesses agreed that the crucial role of government, there's a crucial role for government intervention in the development of AI. So my question again to the panel is, what specific regulatory approaches do you believe would strike the right balance between fostering innovation and protecting against potential harms associated with AI technologies? And I'm going to call specifically on Carrie on this one, because in our pre-meet, you were talking about how users don't necessarily know the dangers sometimes or the risks associated with AI. So I was wondering if you had a take on this question.
Yeah, they actually ended that session. I'm sorry, I'm confusing that session with another session that happened concurrently behind the scenes with the committee with several other experts. Then they ended that session asking this very question. And their answers were exactly what you would expect. Put the right people in the right places. So basically one answer was each agency needs a AI expert, a chief AI expert at the top. That makes sense. I don't know why we don't have that. It seems like we should have that. Everywhere you look, we need to be upskilling people. That makes sense. I don't know why we don't do that already. Procurement people are the linchpin of the entire operation. Don't let the bad stuff in, basically. I mean, why are we letting the bad stuff in? That is your blocker. If you vet the stuff coming in the door, that's going to send a very strong message to industry saying, look, get your house in order, guys, because if you haven't done the right thing, you can't come in here and do the wrong thing to us. We're all liable. So just those handful of things starts to create good governance.
Thank you, Carrie. And can I just encourage our audience to put questions in the chat? We'll be coming to you in a second. Did anybody else want to agree, disagree, build on what Carrie said?
Can I just add, in terms of, we've mentioned conformity assessment, I think that's one thing where UCAS is looking at. We are involved in quite a few projects. We're involved in we are working in the AMIRA committee in the UK on 42001, but we have a lot of other projects with industry and looking at the which actually looks at the competence of people that are actually doing these activities. I think that's probably one of the challenges we quite often see is where these people are going to come from, because it's obviously like any new technology that we get involved with, we're interfacing with government as well. I agree with Carrie. It's about getting the right people in with the right competence, and then for us to be evaluating if there are certification bodies undertaking those audits of organisations that are implementing AI, then that is where we've got to make sure we get it right, to make sure the right people are in the right places too, that the safeguards are in place. But we're seeing it across many different areas, medical and not just management systems. We're seeing schemes being followed up, AI in healthcare and things like that. So it's a growing market for us in terms of conformity assessment.
Building on what Steve and Carrie were saying, I think it's not just AI, right? It's the whole set of technologies, whether it's quantum that's about to come and hit us, whether it's building applications in the cloud, building intelligent workflows, building automation in vehicles. All of those technologies are transforming the way we live our lives. And you can kind of say, hey, look, government needs to sort that out. It's the purview of government to make sure that's good for us. But our argument here is actually that's not the right answer. What we need is, as Steve was saying there, we need competent professionals. They need to work and live within the right kind of ethical foundation or ethical framework, which makes sure what they do is making technology good for society and is doing it in the right kind of way. At the same time, they need to be held accountable for what they do. Right? And I think that accountability point is an important one that we're missing. We haven't really thought through how we ensure accountability of our professionals. And fundamentally, they need to make sure that the solutions that they build are truly inclusive. So they are fit for purpose for everybody. And you see that through a whole bunch of things where we're amplifying bias, we're amplifying certain behaviors in humanity because we don't have data, we don't have enough data that is the correct things. We only got this amount of data, therefore that's all we can amplify. And so just being aware of those kind of implications in the inclusion aspects of the solutions is kind of key. And that's partly why, from a BCS perspective, we are championing responsible computing as a framework for all of those aspects across not just AI, but the whole set of technologies.
Thank you, Rashik. That actually leads beautifully. There is a comment in the comment section from Nikki Danino. He says, getting the right and competent people is hard enough, but ensuring a diverse workforce seems impossible. And then my question with that in mind is to you, especially. Hi.
He says, you said he says, I said she says.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry, Nikki. She said, right, okay. So my question to you, Rashik, as the CEO of a global organization like BCS, is how can cross-sector partnerships across academia, industry, and civil society organizations from the global north and the global south address biases, promote global inclusivity, and bridge the AI divide, and also ensure that AI technologies are developed with fairness and inclusivity by design.
I'll get that done next week, actually. That'd be fine. No, look, that's a fundamental ambition that the BCS has, and it starts from really sharing best practice and learning the best way of doing the right ways of doing things. That's what the responsible computing does. That's what the BCS frameworks and the BCS specialist groups and things like FTAGs that Adam chairs. We try and surface that best practice. That's one pathway. If it's easier to do the right thing, then you're more likely to do that. And if we make it more convenient and accessible, that's helpful for the professionals. The second part is also celebrate the good things, right? So you celebrate the right kind of outcomes, the right kind of ways of doing things, and you celebrate that in a public and an appropriate way. So you're kind of amplifying the right behaviors, and then you start to give kind of role models. So bring out the role models for this kind of behavior and attitude, and showcase them, right? And you've got lots of people on the call that we can call out as role models for the good ways of doing AI and good way of building systems, right?
Thank you, Rashik. Carrie?
Yeah, I'm just, because this is part of my research background, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it has to be purposeful and it has to be from the beginning. So you have to design in your process where exactly you're going to put diverse inputs, multi-stakeholder feedback. You have to go deliberately find it. You have to help educate them, because some of this stuff will be foreign to them. Whenever you bring people in, they don't always understand what language you're using, what you're trying to accomplish. And so you have to, it takes patience. There is friction. It's good friction. You have to embrace the friction, and you have to pay them. They deserve payment. And so it requires effort across the entire life cycle. You don't just do it at the beginning. You do it when you develop the use case. You do it when you're testing the data. You do it when you're testing the interface. You do it when you launch into the wild. You do it after you've launched into the wild for 3 months. I mean, it is across the whole spectrum, and it has to be purposeful. That's my advice.
Thank you, Carrie. My next question comes from the audience, and I'm going to address it specifically to Hadrian as a defender, as a self-confessed defender of this letter that our paper was disagreeing with. James Woodard says that one criticism of some Altman support for AI regulation today is that it just helped big tech, which has the resources to comply, but may stop new entrants to the market. What do you think? And then I'm just going to caveat that with what Carrie just said. Do they have the resource to be constantly checking, to be paying people what they deserve? What's your take on James's question, Hadrian?
No, I think that's an excellent point, and I'm always a bit cynical when I see these companies calling for regulation. I mean, I think we saw it with like Facebook and things like that in the past, where they call for regulation, and then in addition to every proposal they see, they're like, no, but not that one, not that regulation, and so you end up with nothing. So I totally appreciate the cynicism. I think on the other hand, if there are serious harms, and it seems like there could be, and some that might even go beyond this like very sectoral application specific approach. If there are some that are best addressed higher up the food chain, at the level of these big companies, then probably you'll need to do some regulation. I mean, I think there is sometimes a trade-off where if you're taking on as a company an area that is just prone to harms and quite dangerous in some ways, then you're going to have to live up to some responsibilities, and sometimes that requires resources. But I appreciate that it is a really delicate balance, and I also see a lot of these calls with a lot of cynicism.
Thank you.
If I can jump in there, I think one thing that people don't always see is that unlike something like GDPR, where a lot of it is still being litigated, and if the bigger you are, the more lawyers you can afford, and therefore the more you can drag out over years or get away with. Unlike that, all the AI regulations are starting to gravitate towards internationally agreed technical standards. So in the EU and the UK, they're looking at the same technical standards. If you want to mitigate bias in your system, you can go to Europe, or you can go to UK, you can go to US, you're going to see the same best practices. And I think as well as that, there's also market-led audit schemes starting to be developed, like For Humanity, that are starting to provide sort of companies that want to achieve a brand leadership and follow those best practices. So there's no, it's not like we don't know what to do here. There is best practices all over the place, and there is big organizations that are working on them, like ISO IEC. UCAS is starting to look at the outputs of, Steve mentioned 42001, the AI management system, the ISO 27001 of AI, if you like. The sooner we see these things being pushed by regulators, primary regulation, the market, through things like procurement, as Carrie was saying, the better. It is just that that demand to see the evidence that people have followed good practices that is currently missing.
A follow-up question from Nikki. She's saying, which is kind of linked to, not to generalize Asia as being the global south, but large parts of it are in the global south. She's saying that, are they international standards if we cannot get Asia on board?
I mean, China is involved in the production of most of those standards. It becomes very difficult under WTO rules to deviate from internationally agreed standards unless you have particular policy objectives that cannot be achieved with them, which China may have justification for. But also, actually, interestingly, China has raised a complaint with the World Trade Organization about the EU AI Act, which is going through dispute resolution at the moment, saying that it is anti-competitive. I'm not sure that answers the question, but add some color around it.
Thank you for bringing up China. My next question is on transparency.
Can I just add to that about 2001, and just to reconfirm that, in terms of trade deals and things like that, as an accreditation body, we get involved with the UK government on trade deals when there are free trade agreements being developed. So things like 42000, as it is an ISO standard, and I think I can't remember how many countries aren't part of ISO, there's a vast majority of them are, that they are recognised standards that you can base voluntary schemes on, or voluntary certification can be done against it, and that can underpin procurement contracts, as Adam has said, in the same way as environmental and quality and information security can be put into contracts to actually, they have to comply with those standards.
Thank you, Steve. My next question is on transparency. You were just talking about China last month. I think we had our policy jam on TikTok on whether or not it should be banned. And one of the criticism was that the Chinese state was not to be trusted because it's not transparent. So my question is, transparency is mentioned as an important aspect of responsible AI development. Can you elaborate on what it means for organizations or states in this instance to be transparent about the development and deployment of AI? No.
I could say something. I mean, there's lots of levels of transparency, right? I mean, there's ChatGPT telling operators of its system, what data they've used, what mitigations they've applied, etc. There's also kind of that dynamic explainability aspect, which is saying, why did you just do that to an AI, and getting an explanation, which a lot of people think is quite important. And the UK has put a lot more focus on that than say Europe has. And then there's transparency about how it's being used, which is probably the most important, really. It's knowing when people are using facial recognition technology attached to their body camera to actually process information about you as you walk past them. Knowing that those kind of things are happening allows civil society to get involved in those, allows democratically elected politicians to take opinions on those, and regulators as well to take action. So transparency is a huge topic. Even a taxonomy of transparency topics related to AI would run to many, many pages.
Yeah, I kind of build on what Adam was saying there. The transparency part, it needs to be thought through in the context. It's not just transparency per se. It's transparency of the data source. It's transparency of how we're using that data, transparency of the AIs, and transparency of the outcomes, right? Because sometimes the outcomes we want to achieve, they're ones that we may question whether they're appropriate or not. So we're going to think through the whole layering of transparency and understand how we put it into things that make sure that the systems are being used for the right purposes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, at very minimum, regulation should require whenever you're using AI and a human is interacting with it, that should be known. I should never encounter AI and not know that I'm using it or it's being used on me, period. Medical setting, driving on the road, in an office somewhere while I'm working, when my kid is at school, wherever that is, I want to know that it's being used. And then, of course, I'm going to have 700 other questions about it, but I at least want to know that it's being used on me or about me.
Thank you, Carrie. And what you're saying about knowing when you use, then you can make informed consent on whether or not you want to proceed, right? Which is an ethical provision. So with that in mind, Tonya Pitchford has asked in the comments, should more tech companies employ ethical tech teams?
So let me answer that. And as I think there needs to be a level of expertise around ethics and how ethics is applied in the projects. We've got to be careful that you don't end up with abdicating the responsibility of ethics down to this group. And we do whatever we want, as the ethics police will handle it, right? And every professional needs to understand the ethical nature of what they're doing and making sure that they bring that into their daily lives. You can't regulate for this. It needs to be brought into the activities that everybody's doing all the time. Similarly, am I doing enough to make the world more sustainable, right? Am I thinking about that as I work on this project? Am I thinking about the data sources to make sure I'm being truly transparent with the technologies I'm building? So I think those are all concerns which need to be brought into the ways in which a professional does their work on a day-to-day basis, with access to expertise like an ethics expert, an ethics guru that supports them, because there's always grey areas and you need to be able to understand where you are in that stride. There's nothing that's ever black and white there, right?
Yeah, I think maybe just bouncing off of that point, I feel like often there's a tendency to like put together the ethics team, then they'll take care of the ethics, and then people who are working maybe more on development don't have to feel like they don't have to think about it because it's handled by the ethics team. And the ethics team, this sort of glorified research arm that puts out research that doesn't even get used by the company, and then are very easily dismissed when they start getting a bit annoying or rubbing the company the wrong way. So I think ethics teams might be useful, but you really want to integrate that into the attitudes of the entire team rather than have it just outsourced to the side.
I like ethics with a little e. Ethics should be part of everyone's job, competencies. They should be signed up to a code of ethics, and we need to have a tech workforce that demonstrates that level of ethics. And I don't think there is a chief ethics officer role in the world, and I don't think there should be ethical tech professionals with a big E. I think at the point that you've got down to using ethical systems to make decisions, that means there's no law covering what you need to do. There's no clear guidance from regulators. There's no technical standards. So your only way of making a decision is to make it an ethical decision point. And I think at that point, it should never be a single person making that decision. It should involve diverse stakeholders and probably more committees than roles.
So this point always, I'm growing a little irritated with this debate over whether we should have ethics. It keeps coming back to me to think, are we debating whether or not we should protect civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy? Because when we talk about ethics, oftentimes we're just talking about civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy. I mean, it gets really muddy sometimes. Those things are pretty clear. And oftentimes when we're heads down doing our work, we might forget, oh, that actually is a civil right or a privacy issue. Maybe we don't need to know what someone's shoe size is when we're asking for their resume data. And we would want that to run through what we're calling the ethics committee. I don't know another way to call it, the Civil Rights, Civil Liberties, and Privacy Committee. We just label it the ethics committee. So we're using that label, and then we're debating the label when really what we're doing is just giving people their human rights. So I don't know that the debate is, I feel like it's a little off-centered to me anyway.
Thank you, Carrie. I think you've got everyone thinking with that. I can see it on their faces. I do have a question in the comments from Elliot Prince. He says, I think this is addressed to you, Adam, because you mentioned sandboxes earlier. What is the panel's position on problems of alignment? An agentic AI would know it's being tested and behave differently in testing versus live deployment. He doesn't see how sandboxes would solve that problem.
Oh, that's easy. I think we're a long way away from an AI being sentient enough to know that it's being tested rather than just to appear that it is.
Thank you. Okay. And then another question from Elliot. He says, does the panel agree that transparency in regards to decision making is not always desirable? AI systems may reason, similar theme, I think. AI systems may reason in a way that we do not understand, and the outcome may be better. To take AlphaGo, it develops strategies that no human would if we asked it to explain every decision, excuse me, if we asked it to explain every decision and only allowed ones that we understood, it would be less good at its task. Still same answer, still same stance, Adam?
Well, I think there's lots of different types of transparency and explainability, and they depend on who the audience is and the purpose of it. You know, if I'm a forensic incident investigator trying to figure out exactly why an AI system did a thing, then I would probably want a very different level of information and a much more technical level of information to an end user. And I don't think transparency always means being even explainability. I don't think that always means being able to explain locally why a particular outcome was reached based on a particular input. It may mean just providing generalized information about the types of inputs and outputs and how the system normally reacts to those. So I think unpacking transparency and explainability is a huge task that both the literature and the international standards is struggling with.
So I try and look at these things with three relatively simple equations, right? There's raw data, which we do something with algorithms, models, whatever, and that gives us some kind of information. And that you know, data plus algorithms equals information is something that we've looked at from the industry for a long time. That information, when it's put into some kind of context, will give us some new insight, right? And we use that insight, whether it's ChatGPT type insight or whether it's insight around a particular sensor and what's happening with that sensor and where it fits in the whole system, whether this car's going to turn left or turn right. And then ultimately there's a human involved in there, that because that insight will drive an action from an individual, and that action will deliver an outcome. And as you think about those three equations and how those equations are layered, you can start to then see where ethics comes into each of those levels, where transparency comes into each of those levels, where models fit in those levels, where human actions, whether it's a professional, whether it's a user, whether it's a owner of the designer of the technology that you're using at those different points, you can start to see where we fit into that structure. And then you start to say, well, where do the sandboxes need to be? Well, the sandbox needs to be in all those three layers. And so what you've got to have a system-wide view and understand where the connections are, whether you use the kind of three equations that I use to start things off, whether you have your own systems view, or whether you have a different way of looking at that. The frameworks and models help you make sense of what is a hugely complex landscape. And at the moment, we've got people who are protecting different parts of the landscape, the value chain, coming and trying to own and drive these activities, rather than people stepping back and saying, hey, do I understand the whole context? Do I understand the whole system? And do I understand the full ramifications here? Or if not, then how do I start to think through that, making sure that what I'm doing is appropriate, sensible, valuable, viable, and all those kinds of things.
I think maybe also speaking to this idea that there's many different levels of transparency, because the word is sort of overloaded. And I think what was it Elliot that asked the question was referring to is what's more often called explainability, which is specifically about like a sort of technical version explaining exactly what the model did. Personally, I think that's a really, really tough challenge. I mean, it's a very open area of research. It's very easy to make misleading explanations. And as you get into bigger, more complex models, it starts to even become less meaningful. And so that kind of explainability might be useful in sort of narrower settings where you have like a specific goal in mind, where, I don't know, if you've been refused for credit by an automated system or something, maybe you want an explanation that just tells you what could you have done different to be accepted, and you have like a very specific question in mind. But a question of the sort, like, why did it make this decision in some very open-ended way, is just very hard to answer, and I think probably not that valuable an endeavor at this point. And then I think there's a lot of value to having transparency, as we talked about, the more sort of governance level and the institutional level, to understand how the outputs from this machine are being used, what the inputs were, to try and gain more context on how that decision's going to affect you. But yeah, some kind of like, I don't think explainability is a panacea where suddenly we'll be able to open the box on all these algorithms and suddenly understand exactly how they work and predict how they'll behave in every single situation, stuff like that. I think that's sort of a false hope at this point.
Thank you, Hadrian. I do actually have a similar stream question from Cara Barnes. She says, how do you ensure that the general public has trust and comfort around AI and those who use it as mainstream, when the mainstream media has portrayed it as a danger for many years? So since we can't open it and understand exactly how it works, the average person doesn't understand the mechanics of it. How do we build public trust when the media seems to be portraying it as this big, bad and dangerous thing?
That question is worded so interestingly to me, because I would have said the opposite is true, that the mainstream public blindly trusts the internet more than they trust the media saying the internet is broken. So that's an interesting perspective on the kind of an opposite view of it. I mean, coming from America, apparently nobody trusts anything over here right now. So I don't know that I'm in a position to answer that question. The example I used the other day was hair dryers. When we finally developed handheld hair dryers in the 50s, and everybody's like, yay, hair dryers, this is fantastic. And it took us 30 years before we put a label on the hair dryers that said, hey, don't put these in the bathtub. They're probably going to electrocute you. So I feel like we're in that phase with some of this, chat GPT stuff. It's like, by the way, this stuff could harm you, but that label doesn't exist on that. So everybody's just using it like it's perfect. Some people understand it, but most people don't. And the media is kind of like, hey, by the way, some of this, but there are people in the media that are saying it's great. There are optimists that don't want to say there are bad parts, and they deliberately don't. Drives me crazy. I'm an ethicist, so I see the dumpster fire, but that's just me. I don't know. Interesting question. Thank you.
I'd agree with Carrie, but if I reframe the question to, when we fix the issues, how do we ensure that the mainstream public is well informed about the risks of a specific AI product? Then I'd say we need to be getting to the point where we have labeling on services and products. In a similar way, when you buy a house, you see the energy efficiency rating. When you buy a food product or a medicine, the standardized labeling that's designed to simplify complex information. But we haven't achieved that around cybersecurity and social media and lots of other things. So I don't think that's going to be there quick, because before we can have a traffic light style system, we need to really understand. We need to all agree on what the difference between green and amber is, or amber and red.
Thank you, Adam and Carrie. I see that Dan has raised his hand.
Hello, was that an invitation for me to join?
Sure.
Thanks. So it's interesting. So I probably thought my thinking was aligned more with Cara's perspective, actually, interestingly different from Cara and Adam. So we at BCS poll, and I'll put a link to the poll. We did a YouGov poll of public attitudes around algorithms, using algorithms to make decisions about our lives. And overwhelmingly, people were distrustful when we asked them the question about whether they trusted algorithms to be used to make decisions around healthcare or decisions around taxes or justice or anything like that. And what we, my role at BCS, I'm head of policy, and I work a lot with parliamentarians and other lobbyist groups. And what we find often is an encroaching Luddite style thought process that is almost getting captured within the culture war aspect of things. So, and technology in some ways is seen as this war against professionals and war against experts. And there is a danger, I think, that could be something that we get swept up with. So I just wanted to give a counter thought process to that. Anyway, I'll shut up now and get off your screen.
Can I build on what Dan was saying there? Because I think it's not just mainstream media. We need to think about journalists and writers. But when you think about the science fiction writers, many of our fears and worries come from what we've seen on movies or read in books. And so you kind of think, oh, well, this is the building of HAL, or it's building of the Ex Machina, whatever your favorite AI fear related story is. And I think those are amplified because when you go and watch a movie, the level of quality and level of video imagery makes it look very, very real. And augmenting that with music and that kind of sensation, you feel that that's right. So when you start seeing some AI in real life, you're almost blurring the reality from what you've seen in these movies. And I think that's an important aspect of what's happening here. So media and society in general feed off some of these fears that people have built because of a whole bunch of things that happened in the past. And it goes back right to many, many years of Asimov and all the rest of it.
I think that's actually harmful as well, the way that the media associates everything with the sci-fi version of AI. I mean, we only have to look to the Netherlands to see what happened there when they're using algorithm in the child state benefits system, and the net result over time was over 1,000 children were moved into foster care because of a change in the algorithm. And that brought down the government over there. So, let's stop focusing on what AI might do when they invent the next thing, and let's look at all the harm that it can cause right now if used without appropriate controls.
Thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm trying to speak for a long time. I had a question, and I've been ignored throughout.
Yeah.
My question is, hello, thank you. I'm Soundhanarayan, a member. I'm a comparative ignoramus in relation to all of you. My question is, would we have a human at the end of any AI system to override if there was a problem, an unhappy path, an unintended consequence?
So something, I think the ultimate human at the end is the one that switches off the computer, right? So there is a way of always switching off. You say there isn't a switch off, but there is always some kind of switch off mechanism that we can put in place. That's a bit kind of blunt as an instrument. Many of the AI tools that we have are actually augmenting human activity, right? Whether it's a radiology analysis of your X-ray or your CT scan, and how that set of insights is being used by a radiologist to make a diagnosis for you, and whether they accept what the AI is saying or not is a decision they make. So I think the answer is it depends. I think we do need to have a way of having a human override wherever possible, because we can't necessarily rely on the AI for everything, and we don't want to abdicate the human activity to AI. AI is there, and I would say all of digitalization technology is there to simplify and improve life, and augment what humans do, not replace what humans do. And as long as we keep doing that and we recognize that, I think we're in good shape. Now, can we stray into areas where we shouldn't be, like the Netherlands example Anna was talking about, or we talk about the A-level result algorithms, or we talk about
loan applications being turned down? Yeah,
exactly. So like a loan, what is the right of appeal? What's the right of all those kind of questions? That those are important questions, and part of what we're saying with the sandboxes is, you can build the systems and then put them through the right kind of sandboxes to test those unintended consequences. Did we intend to stop these people getting health insurance, getting a mortgage, getting a loan or whatever. And the answer from humans is no, it wasn't. So why did that happen? How do we correct that? And that's the process of improvement that we need to put in place. And I would say most enterprises where they're using these generative AIs, they are doing that and they're thinking through that very carefully. That's part of the accountability aspect of what a professional should do. And when we think about responsible computing, the way we explain that accountability is catering for those kind of points, I would say.
Let me just add to this conversation. To me, so back to my hairdryers. You know what doesn't have a label? Electrical outlets. Do you know what we all know not to do? Put a knife in one of them. There's no label on it. We all just know that. So what's missing from what we have today is a general societal understanding of some of the things that happen with AI. So when we talk about upskilling people and helping people come along the learning curve, we do tend to talk about a hierarchical learning curve. So where we start at the top, the executives and board members need to understand the stuff so that they can put controls in place, and we move that on down so hiring managers understand that this part of the tech affects their people, and we move it on down. What we really need to do is burn the candle at both ends. Society needs to understand, and the decision makers need to understand, and we need to move that learning to the middle so that everybody understands their parts and their responsibilities of understanding these technologies. There is a great bias in just trusting whatever spits out of the technology. So we need to develop programs that help people understand the flaws and the beauty in these technologies so that we don't just go around sticking knives in electrical outlets accidentally. That's the human in the loop part.
Just to add to the response to Sundar's question, in the context of a loan application being declined by an AI or another algorithm, you already have the right in law to request a human to review that in both the UK and the EU. So that is already in place.
I would also maybe just add that I think, while this is a useful solution in general, it probably won't scale. I don't expect that in the future, or even really today, there are humans looking over every decision made by an AI and able to sort of steer us back to the right path in case it goes off. And if anything, that sort of defeats the purpose of these systems to some extent. And something I worry about for the future, getting back to this, maybe this trust idea, which I think is relevant, is I think as people interact with these systems get better and they just get more used to it. Even if they're skeptical now, I think as soon as they see that, like, oh, I asked it to do this thing for me, it like did it very well, that trust is going to build pretty quickly. And I think maybe too quickly, and there'll be even less oversight than we'd like. And I think in parallel, we're going to have systems that are more and more agentic. So instead of, just a chat bot that you talk to, it gives you an answer, and then you sort of come away with that answer and do what you want. You'll have more and more systems that will be able to do entire tasks for you under less and less oversight and with more and more trust. And so I think the combination of these means that the sort of human monitoring elements, A, won't be enough, but B, if anything, might be counterproductive because we think we'll have someone monitoring it and they'll just sort of greenlight a lot of these decisions without thinking.
I think you're right, Hadrian, but I think it ties back into transparency. I don't think people know that they're having decisions made about them by an algorithm. I don't think they know their rights because you wouldn't unless you read all the small print. But I kind of agree with you, it's not scalable. I think we need to think about three types of this thing where a human gets involved. There's oversight, which might be by humans or it might actually be automated. And that might be in a particular risk scenario. Then there's controllability, the ability to intervene in an AI system immediately to prevent harm and hazard, which you'd certainly need to do in a safety critical context. And then there's the ability to redress, which is applicable for sort of the loan example. And we shouldn't be regulating these things. We should be saying that people must manage the risks, right? And then as the AI systems improve, they can select the appropriate mitigations based on the general quality and accuracy of the AI system. Maybe today we do need humans reviewing everything. Maybe in a year, we start to move to more automated oversight methods with some form of emergency brake button for the human operator that's trying to stop it taking over the world. I think in essence, we need to take a risk-based approach to this.
Thank you, everyone. I am conscious of time, so I think I'm just going to do one last question from my panel, which I will ask all of you to give your final thoughts on. And it's, as we look ahead, what steps do you think we need to take to strike the right balance between AI innovation and responsible development? Can I start with Rashid? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, so yeah, we want to be able to do two things. One is understand the problems where these AI technologies can best help and improve society, and laying out those problems and defining those challenges in a way which inspires the right activities and builds our confidence, builds our trust in those systems is going to be key. So how do we build out those use cases that we should focus on and get society around those is one big aspect of what we're doing. The second thing is we need professionals to have the right competence and skills and know how to be accountable, know how to be ethical, know how to be inclusive in what they do. So we need to surface the best practices and make that easily accessible and make that commonplace in the industry. And then the third thing we have to do is we have to work with the people that are driving the core innovations, right? Whether that's in the academia space, in the research that's going on, whether that's in startups. We need to use our convening power and our influence to be able to set the right kind of challenges and questions in a way which stewards that towards the right aims, right? So it's kind of taking the challenges and ideas and making sure we connect those together with having the right professionals in the middle. And I think we can do that. And part of what we've been doing with the BCS as I've taken on the role is driving that more and more. And by having structures and groups that come together, whether it's specialist groups, whether it's member organizations, or whether it's the organization that we work with, and then surfacing those best practices in frameworks like Responsible Computing Framework, we start to do a lot of that. And the more we do that, the more we democratize good, the better we are to serve what we need to do.
Thank you.
Can I just add, from a conformity assessment point of view, I think it's like any new area or any area that we get involved in. We've mentioned about 42,001, which is about the management system, but going back to the individual systems, there's also possible conformity assessment against those systems, against a set of criteria, in the same way as we would a television. There will be a product certification for a television. So there is the regulatory side where you're actually or testing the system against the regulation, or you can have voluntary schemes where somebody might create a set of criteria against which something is measured and certified, and there is that option as well. But I think the challenge is we are seeing so many initiatives. It's actually keeping on top of that and coming back to this whole thing about the competence of the people involved in the development of these schemes and also the evaluation of them. But it's been done in other areas, so there's no reason why we can't attempt to do it in there as an industry.
I would add to that, there is an international standard for hairdryers. Sorry.
Only just.
I don't know if my other panelists want to come in. If not, there have been a couple of questions from the audience. So either way.
Okay, so my perspective on this is governance roles, governance policies, governance practices. So the roles you need, like I said, you call it ethics if you want to label it that way. It's really human rights stewards at the end of the day. So you need roles, and that's their job. They're watchers. They just make sure we're doing the right things from a human rights perspective. Your policies set the boundaries, right? Set the boundaries for, this is what we believe safe AI looks like. Let's try to stay within these boundaries. If we get outside the boundaries, we got a problem, let's bring it back in. And then your workforce needs to be appropriately skilled, and you need to be doing the right things in practice, which is the stuff that we talked about. Diverse feedback, make sure your supply chain is responsible, because we didn't even touch on the supply chain and what that part looks like. Hiring a diverse workforce, staying current with those skills, capturing the incidents and adjudicating them appropriately, and documenting your system, things like that. So just being on top of your stuff, rules, policies, appropriate processes. That's my advice.
Thank you, Carrie.
I'll maybe come in then to round us off. I'll say maybe just to close that I tend to think about this in two different ways. I think there's a lot of risks that are covered very well by doing sort of application specific, look at the laws we have, try and understand exactly how they apply and how we shape the use of AI in each application. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there probably is another class of risks that have more to do with that I think, are especially present with very more general systems, foundational models, like the type sort of leading AI companies are making, which might be more prone to misuse. And I think if you have models and dangerous capabilities, there's a whole question of how do you make those available? How do you avoid people having access to those capabilities? And I think there are also important questions about when you have models like this that are underpinning so many different applications, how do you ensure that they behave reliably, that they behave in direction you want, especially when there aren't best practices? And I think the talk of best practices is great, and it was great, and I agree with spreading them, but there's also, in many cases, we have relatively little experience with some of these systems, especially at the scale we're building them today. And you can look at OpenAI, they've put out all of their best practices for building their system. Are those really good enough? I think that's sort of a question that lingers with me, and I'm not sure what to do in that situation. How do you judge if they're good enough? Part of it's experience, but I think in some cases we're not going to get a lot of tries before there are maybe some large scale harms. And so I would maybe some of that I think warrants some extra caution that goes beyond the sort of application specific focus.
Super, thank you so much, Hadrian. I am conscious of time. I think it's a nice time to round off. Having said that, we did have some questions actually in the chat that we didn't get to. If you are keen to get those answered, please do email them to policyhub@bcs.uk, and we can forward them to the panelists, and I'm sure they'd be happy to email you, and they are online. I think I found them all on LinkedIn if you want to connect and have chats with them further. But thank you to my panelists, thank you to the audience, thank you all for taking the time to be here. Thank you again to Carrie and Hadrian for waking up super early to join us. Thanks for your participation. And I think that's where we'll end today's Policy Jam. Thanks, everyone. Take care.